Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is the story of one of the nation's most notorious wrongful convictions, that of Steven Avery, a Wisconsin man who spent 18 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. But 2 years after he was exonerated of that crime and poised to reap millions in his wrongful conviction lawsuit, Steven Avery was arrested for the exceptionally brutal murder of Teresa Halbach, a freelance photographer who had gone missing several days earlier. The innocent man had turned into a cold-blooded killer, or had he? This is narrative nonfiction at its finest, and a true crime thriller. The book that we are featuring this evening is The Innocent Killer, a true story of a wrongful conviction and its astonishing aftermath, with my special guest, journalist and author and prosecutor, Michael Griesbach. Pardon me. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Michael Griesbach.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you very much. So I just got you late coming onto the program, so I just introduced the program and read about the synopsis of the book, and what a heck of a book it is. Welcome back to the program, and glad to have you back on this updated version of the book. So tell us, without giving really anything away, the last time I interviewed you the book was called Unreasonable Inferences.
Right.
So tell us what the new title is and what has happened in your book writing career that this book has been re-released and updated, and tell us about that.
Absolutely. Well, the American Bar Association developed an interest in the story and in the book, and they wanted to republish the book. So this is published by the American Bar Association, and it is titled The Innocent Killer, a true story of a wrongful conviction and its astonishing aftermath. And it has some new material, including an afterword from the Innocence Project, the Wisconsin Innocence Project, who was responsible for the exoneration of Steven Avery, who was later arrested and convicted of a subsequent murder. And the book also has a postscript from the victim who survived the first crime for which Mr. Avery was wrongly convicted. That's Penny Bernson. So it's a complicated tale, one that has a lot of lessons for the criminal justice system, I think, and one that is just hard to make this sort of horrific story up. It really is stranger and more frightening than fiction in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Well, let's get right to that, because the last time, without the additional information, we could have spent at least a couple hours, because this is not. It's also because of the complexity and you being a prosecutor, but the story, like you said before, the story itself is so spellbinding and incredible and ironic and twists and surprises that let's get right to that. Now, we will concentrate a little bit more in this interview about the aftermath, basically after Steven Avery is released. And I don't want to jump ahead for the audience that doesn't know anything about this case at all. So let's go back to Penny Bernson and the beach, and let's start there. Let's start with who she was and what was she doing that day and what was her routine, and tell us a little bit about the background of the community itself, a little bit as an introduction, and then introduce Penny and what happened that fateful day on the beach.
Sure thing. The date that this happened was June 27th of 1985. So we're going on, 25 plus years ago that the first crime happened. And it occurred in the city where I'm a prosecutor, in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, which is between Milwaukee and Green Bay, essentially, right on the shores of Lake Michigan. A city of about 50,000, kind of a blue-collar town, and some touristy areas as well. But that day, back in July of 1985, Penny Bernson, who incidentally ran with her husband a chocolate dictionary, basically a candy store, a real popular spot, an ice cream parlor, and a tourist attraction in its own right downtown in our historic downtown. And they were sort of prominent members of the community. Tom, her husband, his grandparents actually started the old candy store back in the, I think, 1920s. And Penny was a YMCA fitness instructor in addition to running the day-to-day operations at the candy store. She was roughly 30, if memory serves, years old, had a few children, a young son and a young daughter, and together the Bernson family went to the beach, the Lake Michigan beach, about 10 miles north of Manitowoc in a very isolated stretch of a state forest called Point Beach State Forest. Penny ran daily because she had this exercise class at the YMCA. She was very fit, very attractive young woman. She ran north from the beach into the isolated stretch, pine trees, towering pines to the left, and Lake Michigan, sparkling Lake Michigan to the right. She ran barefoot in her bikini north along and passed a scraggly-looking fella in street clothes. It was about 85 degrees, but he had street clothes on. As she ran up, and she was sort of taken aback, but he said, "Nice day," or something, and she said, "Yeah, nice day for a run." But on her way back, the scraggly-looking fella in street clothes had walked about a mile further north, or a half mile further north at any rate. Her run was 6 miles, and she had made the turnaround and made it about halfway back when she saw him again. This time, though, hiding in the midst of a poplar tree close to the shoreline. And Penny knew pretty quickly that she was in trouble. She tried to run away toward the water. She even went into the water. He followed her. She was running, got up about thigh deep, considered diving into the water, but then thought she'd drowned in a struggle. So she angled back toward the shore, and the assailant grabbed her. She is a small person in stature. I think she was probably like 105 pounds. And she fought back, struggled back, kicked everything, but he manhandled her over the sand dunes and tore off her clothing and tried to rape her. Penny fought back. Amazing how hard she fought back. Wasn't getting what he wanted. He beat her to a bloody pulp. Inexplicably, really, he ran away. I don't know if he thought somebody saw him or what. Penny was dazed, totally naked, just tried crawling, if you can imagine that, to the water, but gave up halfway and basically passed out for a while. Just staring off into the sparkling Lake Michigan waters, and then finally made it down a half hour later to the beach after she came to, at which time a couple in a sailboat saw her, and she was rescued. Basically, her husband and the EMTs rushed her to the hospital then, and she had received numerous very severe injuries. So that's how all this started.
Now, maybe I'm mistaken. Wasn't there, and this is important because of at the trial, but wasn't there something about the husband carrying her from the beach to the parking lot after the ambulance or the EMT had been called?
You're right. The husband sent a jet ski rider up looking for her, and he himself started running north and saw her on the beach. Or actually, she had already started walking back with the help of these two people in a sailboat who saw her. They gave her a blanket, and she was in between them, with her arms wrapped around them. Her husband, Tom, saw them as he's running north and ran up, of course, and ended up carrying Penny partway back to this park where they were, and then the ambulance rushed her to the hospital in Manitowoc.
Okay, now how serious were her injuries?
Yeah, Penny suffered a fractured nose, bruises all over, I believe an eye socket fracture as well. She was admitted to the hospital that night. A long period of recovery here. The assailant, or who the police at that time believed or charged with the crime, was charged with attempted first-degree intentional homicide as well as sexual assault, because there was sexual contact despite Penny's efforts to prevent that, and false imprisonment as well. She thought he had a knife, or at least he talked about a knife. He had banged her head up and down on the sand, the hard sand over these dunes, and just badly bloodied and badly bruised, and some fractures, but alive.
Now, this is very important, and she says that she can readily identify this guy, or she thinks she can possibly identify him. She got a pretty good look at him. Tell us what her description was like, and how seriously police took that description.
Right. Well, you know how things work in a smaller town. It turns out the sheriff was knew of the Bernsons. Tom Bernson came to the hospital and met the sheriff, who personally took an interest in this case, and basically told the Bernsons, no matter what, this kind of thing doesn't happen in this city. We're not going to allow this person, whoever it is, to go free. We'll catch him. So right off the bat, the police are desperate to get a person charged with this crime. Penny, a very intelligent woman, very intelligent person, and took pains during the assault to try to get a good look at the person, knowing that if she survived, she'd like to obviously have the person arrested and convicted. He had a beard, though, and any time in police work and investigations there's facial hair, it's more difficult to really get a real good description. But she had his eye color, his hair color. She said he had what we here in Wisconsin refer to as a beer belly. He was kind of a paunchy kind of guy. She had a rough height. I think it was 5'6", 5'7", and brown or sandy hair and brown eyes. The police, irrationally, in my view, came up with a name almost right off the bat. A person by the name of Steven Avery, who's the main character in this book, both a villain and first a hero, sort of, and then a villain. But they had their eyes on Steven Avery. He was out on bail for actually assaulting or attempting to assault a deputy sheriff's wife. And the Avery clan was known to the sheriff's department. He lived, about 10 miles from the beach. But for whatever reason, they thought, it sounds like Steven Avery. He has a beard. Although never mind that his hair or his eyes are blue, they're not brown, and he's short. He's about 5'2" versus 5'7" or so that Penny thought her assailant was. But at any rate, so the sheriff had a mugshot brought down of Mr. Avery from his prior arrest a few months earlier, and numerous other photos, and they conducted a photo array. Now, Dan, this was 1985, before photo arrays are now done much better in the United States, partially because of this case.
Okay.
In terms of how things are presented to a witness or a victim. But they did show Penny the photos. First they actually did a composite sketch, and this is important. The composite sketch artist from the Sheriff's Department, first composite sketch he's ever done. He received some training at Quantico FBI in Washington, D.C., but it's the first composite sketch he ever did on a case. He met Penny, and many people believe that he actually looked at the mugshot of Mr. Avery before he met Penny, being told that he's a suspect, which is a big no-no. And he started drawing this artist sketch of an assailant with Penny chiming in, giving him a brief description. And they ended up with a composite sketch of someone who the picture was later commented to be a uncanny resemblance, was the word the trial judge used, to Mr. Avery's mugshot. And once that image was in Penny's mind, it's thought, and there was psychological testimony from a UW, University of Wisconsin, and Harvard law and psychologist, once a person has an image in their mind of the assailant, that becomes their assailant from that point forward. And it might not be the right person, but if there's a photo array or a composite sketch like this, everything after that, that is the assailant in that person's mind. So when they brought the photo array, including Avery's mugshot, up to Penny after she did the composite sketch, she picked out Mr. Avery as her assailant.
Now, you said it made changes in part because of a case like this. What did they do with that photo array at that time? How would they have conducted themselves with the photo array at that time as opposed to now, according to the new rules?
Right, that's a good question. At that time, they put all the photos on one sheet, basically, and had the person look at all of them together. And oftentimes the police would even tell the witness or the victim in this case that the suspect is in there. And they would even have the same investigating officer, like in this case the sheriff, do the photo array. And it was basically the person's job would be to sort of confirm for the police that there is, first of all, a suspect, that one of these people is the suspect. That's the first thing. And then, just pick out the one that's sort of in their mind. Now, partially because of the Avery Task Force, which we'll get to later, and other cases throughout the United States too, there are new policies and procedures where they sequentially show the suspects to the victim or to the witness. So it's one at a time. It's not, here's 6 or 7 people, can you pick out the one? And then it's not so much a comparison between 6 or 7 to see who looks most like the suspect, but now it's, is this the person? Also, the best practice is not to have the investigating officer, but a different officer who doesn't even know about the case or the suspect, conduct a photo array. So those are 2 big changes, and you never, ever tell a witness or a victim that the suspect is in this lineup, that they have a suspect in mind, because then the victim's job is sort of to confirm for the police what, and the victim, let's face it, we all think, oh, the police know what they're doing. They care. They want to get this guy, and I'm sure they got it right. They know so much more, and I just want to make sure I help out. So things have improved quite a bit on photo arrays, thank goodness.
Now, I want to know, and you don't really point it out in the book too much, but, I mean, I think it's important when you talk about, that they didn't grab this suspect out of thin air, even though we will see that they have had no real evidence. But
right.
That the idea that and tell us about the actual charges that he was on bail for at this time involving the deputy's wife. Tell us exactly the kind of crimes that might affect the sheriff enough to frame an innocent man.
You bet. Well, Mr. Avery was one messed up individual. The crime for which he was on bail was basically getting into his pickup truck, rushing down the street, the country road he lived on, after his neighbor, who's the sheriff's deputy's wife, got in her car to go to work at 6 in the morning. And he would do this repeatedly. He would watch her as she got out, morning after morning. He knew when she'd leave. He would be naked. One time he even ran into the road naked in front of her. He, on this particular occasion, got in his truck, got up to highway speeds behind her, rammed into her car, his pickup truck into her car. She lost control momentarily, but was able to regain control, pulled the car over. He approached her, this is Steven Avery, the suspect in the other case, with a shotgun. He approached her with a shotgun, held it to her head. He wanted her to get into his car. He was clearly going to assault her. She pointed to the back seat and said, "My 1-year-old baby's back there. I'm dropping my daughter off at my grandmother or my mother's for babysitting before I get to work. And if you take me, this baby will freeze." This was January in Wisconsin. Maybe not quite as bad as Winnipeg, but close.
Close. Yeah.
And Avery, let's give a little credit where credit is due. Even he had some standard below which he wouldn't go. He let her go. But the police, she knew exactly who he was. He was arrested, charged with all kinds of serious crimes, and was on bail, somehow posted. Bail was only set at $5,000 cash, and he came up, or his parents came up with the $5,000 cash bail, so he was free this next summer at the time that Penny Burnson was assaulted.
In terms of crimes, because what you say in the book, and again, I got to ask a question, why? Because it doesn't seem to be completely explained to me that there seemed to be some evidence that he was likely to rape this woman. Did he have a background of other sexual offenses other than, again, not to downplay exposing yourself to people intentionally either.
Right.
But was there a psychological element to this? Tell us a little bit more about Mr. Steven Avery and his criminal background, and if there is any psychological background.
Yeah, one of the things police and prosecutors too we notice, and crime psychologists I think too, that there's certain offenses that catch people's attention, and one of them is cruelty to animals. And Steven Avery had lit a cat on fire when he was in his mid-teens. And another is fire. He talked often about lighting his girlfriend's on fire. He poured sand down her gas tank, and kind of a fascination with fire. Really no particular sex offenses that he was convicted of, at least. He had a burglary conviction prior to that, and this most serious, obviously, sex-motivated, I'll call it, crime when he rammed into this woman's pickup truck. Mr. Avery, the Avery clan is what people in this area call them. They live on a salvage yard, a rural salvage yard. His dad started the business. probably 10 years before this crime, the 1985 crime, or even more. Actually a successful salvage yard. It's in a rural area, hilly area in Wisconsin, kind of a creepy place, but apparently a very successful salvage yard. And he and his brothers all had criminal pasts, and it's understandable how the police sort of zeroed in. To some extent, it's understandable how they zeroed in on Mr. Avery. After all, it was his. It was a sheriff deputy's wife, and police, they protect their own. They were aware that he was out on bail for that. And another interesting twist here is Steven Avery's uncle, Arland Avery, was a deputy himself at that time, one of the few Averys who was kind of on the right side of the law. I know Arland, neat guy, actually. He's retired now. But so the Avery clan was certainly within the consciousness of the police. And I guess a bearded person, that's about as close as the description came, frankly. And they just, right off the bat, pinned him to it in their mind with very little, and soon very much evidence to suggest that he didn't do it, but they went ahead anyhow.
Well, let's first talk about evidence gathering at that time, because we're talking about 1985, and so DNA, it's still, I can't say exactly, but I know it's maybe not completely vetted in court yet. I know it's in its infancy in terms of the science itself. So tell us what the evidence they did gather, and tell us how they proceeded with that evidence. What evidence did they have before we start talking about what evidence they didn't have? For example,
Sure.
Alibi.
You bet. Well, the one thing they had, so far was Penny's identification, although the identification, as we've suggested, was very suggestive, actually, is the word. So they had that, and that's always big, especially if it's a real credible victim who is articulate and comes off very well in court. They had, in terms of physical evidence, they did a search warrant, they looked all through Avery's house, of course. They did what we now call a forensic sex assault examination of Penny after the assault. They did a pubic hair combing, and they found one hair that there was testimony at trial. Serology was the science back then. You're right, DNA evidence, hair or otherwise, did not make it into the court system till about 5 years later, the late 80s and early 90s, really. So it was 7 or so years before that started. But they had this other hair examination science called serology, and a crime lab analyst did testify that a hair found on Penny did not match. They can never say match, but they could say basically is consistent with the type of hair of Steven Avery. Not much, it doesn't really say much. It could be just as easily many, many more people, but at least Avery couldn't be ruled out by the hair. Right. So the DA used the crime lab analyst to examine the hair. And then the only other bit of evidence, physical evidence or otherwise, there were no other witnesses, was a leather jacket that popped up just before trial. The DA sent a letter to the defense counsel saying, oh, by the way, there's going to be evidence from 3 of our officers that they have often seen Steven Avery wear a leather jacket that matches the description of the leather jacket that Penny said the assailant had on. I forgot to mention, in addition to street clothes on this 85-degree day, whoever the assailant was had a leather jacket on with a pretty specific description. It was waist length, it was, buttoned, and it was just a pretty clear-cut specific leather jacket, and lo and behold, right before trial, 3 cops end up saying that, in earlier context we saw Mr. Avery with a similar leather jacket. That's about all the evidence there was.
Now, what was Avery's? What did Avery say to where he was at the time that this could have occurred?
Right. Well, the police went barging into Avery's house. They actually were going to get the SWAT team, but Arland Avery, Steve Avery's uncle, who was a deputy, slowed them down and said, "No, I'll go and act as a go-between. Please don't bring the SWAT team in," because Avery had 5 little kids at the time. But they barged. Fireworks here late, I guess. They barged into his residence at about midnight, and Avery said right away he didn't do it. His alibi was unbelievable. About 12 relatives and friends were together with him at his father's salvage yard, pouring cement that day for some foundations for some sheds or something like that. And most important for the defense, Avery had a receipt from a Shopko store, a department store, up in Green Bay that showed that he and his wife were at the checkout line, because the clerk remembered them with the little kids, at exactly, I believe it was 5:17 p.m. on the day this happened. And Green Bay is about 30 miles north of where the assault occurred. And the assault occurred at, I think, 4:05. It was 4:05 p.m. It was over. That's when the assailant left. And it lasted about 15 minutes. And for Avery to get from the location of the assault on the beach back to his residence to pick up wife and 5 children and get them in car seats, etc., and then drive up to Green Bay and be in the Shopko checkout line at that time was next to impossible. The police ran a dry run and said that they made it but they had to speed, as the officer said, no more than 10 miles per hour over the limit. So we got 65 mile per hour zone on the freeway. So the cops at going 75 claimed that they could make it, but they didn't do the trip back to his residence to pick up the kids like he did. So really the evidence that he did not do it, I thought was overwhelming when I read the transcript.
Now, without giving too much away for what happens later and what you learn a little bit later, who is the prosecutor that has to be in on this in terms of they are the people that finally lay charges? They're part of the investigation with the police. Of course, the police can hold back information. The police are obviously involved in this, but tell us about the prosecutor that must be on board and why he might be on board. We can see why the police might be by looking at this suspect, but now how do you get a DA on board?
Sort of motive of the DA. His name was Dennis Vogel. Mr. Vogel left town shortly after the case, after Mr. Avery's conviction, while it was still up on appeal. He's in private practice in Madison right now, Madison, Wisconsin. He, when he charged it, there's little doubt he thought that Avery was the person. The victim did identify Avery after all, although he could have backed off and saw what else there was, perhaps. But within a few days, he had all the alibi information. I let the reader decide for themselves in the book as to whether Mr. Vogel knew that Avery was innocent, but there's certain things there that I factually say that, I certainly think he knew. Many people thought they knew who the real person was, and the staff in the DA's office at the time and different police agencies even thought that, and the staff actually went up to Vogel and said, "Look, I think you got the wrong guy. We think it's this person. He matches the description, not Avery, and he's been involved in more serious stuff this summer leading up to this sort of thing. The police were even trailing him." But Vogel, in response, told them, the staff, that no, it can't be this other guy. His name is Gregory Allen. It can't be Gregory Allen. We checked, me and the sheriff, and he's on probation for a different crime, and I checked with his probation agent, and he's got an airtight alibi that day. So the DA is telling all these people, nope, it's impossible, it's him, he's got an alibi, I checked, he's on probation. Well, Years later, when I get into the picture, we had to have an independent investigation by the Wisconsin Attorney General review all this, and turns out that Mr. Allen, Gregory Allen, was not on probation at all. So it's pretty clear Mr. Vogel was either making that up or wrong. There was some other evidence too, Dan. Penny Bernson received telephone calls a couple nights after the assault. Many calls late at night asking, where's Tom, her husband, and I know where you live, that sort of thing. Typical behavior by assailants on these type of cases to sort of threaten and intimidate their victim. Well, Avery was locked up, and with orders by the sheriff not to have any access to telephones. So, and Vogel knew that, and the sheriff knew that. So, it couldn't have been Avery because he couldn't make phone calls. And there's other evidence too, exculpatory evidence that was withheld, and all kinds of nasty stuff that as a prosecutor you kind of don't like to see. As anybody you don't like to see, but it doesn't make you proud of your profession as a prosecutor.
What did Penny Burson and her husband Tom think about this, though, while this was going on? These are intelligent people. And so what did they think when they get a call a couple days later? Obviously they would call police. What was the police response to their call? And could they, at that time, did they put two and two together in terms of how could it be Avery if he's locked up?
Yeah, well, they did call the police after they got these, and they even went in. Penny went in and talked to the sheriff, said, look, I'm getting these phone calls, and, what's going on here? Are we sure it's Mr. Avery? And then, in fact, a detective from the Manitowoc Police Department, which is different than the Manitowoc Sheriff's Department, came and told Penny, I really think it might be this other guy. And Penny's a very conscientious, and all these things bothered her. So she went in and talked to the sheriff, and the sheriff's response was, don't listen to anybody else. This is our investigation. It's not the city police department's investigation. And once a prosecutor and a sheriff sit you down and say, look, you did this composite sketch. You picked them out, Penny, not only on a photo array, but on a live lineup, too, because they did one of those. And in Penny's mind, that's why that psychological testimony is so important. That became Mr. Avery's face for years, she told me. That was her imagination of her assailant. He was her assailant in her mind. And the picture of Avery was in her mind, even though he wasn't her assailant. So Penny did what she could, but she was manipulated.
Now, there's an interesting story, too. He has a defense lawyer that seems to be really, the state-appointed lawyers or court-appointed lawyers to defend these people because they don't have the money to defend themselves, if that's the case. And he had two lawyers. And tell us what happened with the first lawyer and what kind of lawyer did they have, not to completely fault them or anything when you're getting exculpatory evidence withheld, but tell us about the tale of the two defense attorneys.
Sure. The first one's name was Risa Evans-Marcis, I believe is her name, staff public defender. And Risa was convinced of Avery's innocence. Most attorneys, defense attorneys, kind of, they think their clients are probably guilty. Most of them, they are. Hopefully, otherwise, why the heck they're charging them? And they know that. But every now and then, they get somebody they believe. And Risa firmly believed that Avery was innocent. In fact, she told investigators later that she would never go to the crime scene to check it out because she was afraid the assailant was still out there somewhere. And Risa filed, I think, 18 motions to suppress all sorts of things and to move the trial and et cetera, including, of course, suppressing the photo identification. She got ill before the motion hearing and has since moved on, or long ago moved on. So successor counsel was appointed, a fellow by the name of Jim Bogert, who now is actually a judge, one county south of here. I thought Jim did a good job with what he had. And like you say, if you don't have all the evidence, if exculpatory evidence is withheld, you're at a disadvantage. He firmly believed also in his client's innocence, fought like crazy. It bothered him so much for years after this conviction. This case will never go away in my mind because there's a lot of pressure on a defense lawyer, more pressure when the person they believe is innocent, because they look at it as their job, and if they fail, an innocent person is going to prison. And that's what happened here, to the tune of 18 years in prison.
Why did they both believe, despite, because the exculpatory evidence is not minor at whatsoever, it's very major and very confirming of innocence, obviously. But why were they so convinced?
I think it was the alibi. I think the fact that they had a receipt was huge, and that these 12 or 18, whatever it was, witnesses thought or were credible in saying that they were with Avery all day, and the fact that these telephone calls went to Penny. If that got through to the defense, I don't recall. But there was other evidence. Avery's description did not match the initial description that Penny gave to the police. So they were able to point out to the jury, or Jim Bogert was, look, Penny, you said your assailant had brown eyes, but my clients are blue. Avery's eyes were real blue. And you said he was 5'7", but he's only 5'2". There was another topic of greasy hands. I don't know if you remember that when you read it, Dan,
yes.
but okay. The Avery clan, they all work on cars. This is salvage yard, so their hands are perpetually greasy, like never clean. And they smell greasy, and they are greasy. Penny was asked several times by the police at the time, were your assailant's hands, did they smell like anything? Were they dirty? And Penny repeatedly said, no, in fact, they smell very clean. So they saw that. The defense lawyers got at least that kind of evidence from the state. The state hid some things or didn't turn over some things.
Right.
But those kinds of things went over. So as a defense lawyer, you get those kinds of things and the phone calls and the alibi, the time slip, the receipt from the Shopko store in Green Bay, and you have a client who's adamant that he's innocent. I can see how they were certain that their client was innocent, and I can see why Jim Bogert felt horrible when the jury, 2 weeks before Christmas in 1985, found Mr. Avery guilty of this crime he did not commit.
Now, okay, so he's sentenced to 18 years, and we don't have enough time to go into the trial and how the prosecutor conducted themselves, but we'll say that what we did talk about last time was something like the judge allowing evidence, recreation of events where the husband discovers his wife raped and beaten, and carries her. So very much conducted sort of on an emotional basis, circumstantial evidence against Avery. He's a bad guy anyway, and so they put him away 18 years. Now, how do you get involved? When do you get involved? And what was your take on this case previous to you being involved?
Right. We moved up here in 1991. I grew up in Milwaukee, and I was a prosecutor down there. I started as a prosecutor up here in 1991, so this is 6 years after Avery was convicted. He already had 6 years in prison. And I was an assistant DA, not the DA. So I was vaguely familiar with the Avery case because I knew it was up on appeal, but I only knew that this guy was claiming he was innocent. Long story, but I ran for election against the DA, and I won the election, but actually did not take office, but stayed here to help the DA as a prosecutor. Shortly after that, this new DA took over. He was actually my campaign manager at the time in the election. We got a call from the Wisconsin Crime Lab, and now this is, 2002. the election was 2002, 2003. And the crime lab called and said, hey, this old case that your former DA there convicted this person of, and that's actually 2 DAs earlier, Mr. Avery, we've got the Innocence Project has been filing motions, and the former DA had fought tooth and nail retesting of any of the evidence. But anyhow, the crime lab's on the phone, and they tell us that this hair, the same hair that was used against Mr. Avery under the old science of hair examination was retested and using DNA technology, and that hair matched not to Mr. Avery, but to a known sex offender by the name of Gregory Allen. And remember, this hair was a hair found on the victim on the night of the assault at the hospital in the sex assault investigation. So now we have a hair of this known offender by the name of Gregory Allen, who is the one that everyone else in Manitowoc, the staff of the DA and the other police agency, were saying they thought was the assailant. His hair, DNA evidence, 1 in 30 billion or whatever the chance is that it's wrong, was on Penny Burnson. So what do you do as a prosecutor when you get that news, this person who spent 18 years in prison but who a jury convicted, who the Court of Appeals twice affirmed, we wanted to make sure before we agreed to release Mr. Avery. So the 2 of us split the file and spent the whole night, essentially. I brought it home. I was sick of working in the office, brought it home and went through the entire transcript of the first trial and became convinced very early on that there's no way Avery did this. It's obviously this other person, Mr. Gregory Allen. And I even became convinced not just that, they probably knew, that the sheriff and the DA probably knew that Mr. Avery didn't do it, but went ahead and convicted him anyhow. So we quickly agreed and signed a stipulation to release Mr. Avery from prison.
Now, we just skipped over one thing that was important, and I think I called it a turning point, and I think it really was, in terms of you're getting some information during that conference call with the State Attorney General regarding Gregory Allen, and you find a criminal complaint in Avery's file about Allen. So tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. While we're still on the phone with the crime lab, the analyst in Madison gives us the name of this known sex offender that the DNA database came in. It's Gregory A. Allen, and she gave the date of birth. And almost at exactly the time she gave that, I was looking through the Avery file. It's a box, actually, and I pulled what I thought were sort of the relevant part, and I'm paging through it, and I see this criminal complaint against a person by the name of Gregory Allen. What is this doing in the Avery file? And I asked the crime lab analyst on the phone still, what's his date of birth? And she gave me the date of birth, and it matched this. Well, that was a criminal complaint signed by Dennis Vogel, who was the DA who wrongly convicted Avery, of an offense charging Allen with a very similar attempt, anyhow, on the same beach a summer or 2 earlier. So Gregory Allen had lunged at a different woman on the same Lake Michigan beach, the same stretch of beach, had dropped his shorts and lunged at this woman who was walking her dog 2 years before he assaulted Penny Burnson. And it was signed by the district attorney himself, Dennis Vogel, who went ahead and convicted Avery. I did some further investigation. My heart just, at that point, I thought, this really smells bad. I mean, this is worse than smelling bad. This is just, beyond pale.
So you are emboldened, and so you're armed with this new evidence. The DNA itself is very strong and compelling when it's a guy sitting in prison with this track record of this sort of thing already. And again, all the other smelly aspects of it. So how long does it take to get
Mr. Avery out. Tell us a little bit about that little fight to get him out, how it was really done, and based on what primarily released him.
Sure. Well, the Innocence Project in Madison was very good. I called them and said, look, we really need to confirm before we do anything. They understood totally. We got a confirmation DNA swab from Steven Avery just to double check. And we checked to see if Gregory Allen, the real assailant, to make sure he wasn't in prison somewhere at the time Penny was assaulted, and he wasn't. So it took about a week, and basically we had a stipulation signed by the Wisconsin Innocence Project attorney and myself and the other prosecutor here, one of the other prosecutors here, and Avery was released under great fanfare. The TV stations flocked up to this northern Wisconsin community where he was in a prison and had pictures of him with his daughters around his arms, leaving with a big smile. It was a huge story in Wisconsin, really the first exoneration of a Wisconsin person. And there's something about Steven Avery. He became kind of a quick folk hero and a person who withstood a great injustice, and people just liked him. He's kind of a character. I meant to correct one thing, Dan, real quick. Gregory Allen, on the case where I saw the complaint in Vogel's file, he just got a fine for that. Vogel amended it to disorderly conduct and gave him a fine. But Gregory Allen was in prison, though, when I came into the picture, when Avery was exonerated, because after he assaulted Penny Burnson and got away with it because they went after Avery, 7 or 8 years later, left free to roam the streets and repeat his crime, he broke into an apartment in Green Bay and viciously raped the woman inside. He was charged with, among other offenses, wearing a bulletproof garment, which I had never seen before, but I take it in case the police came after him or something. We also found out he was wanted suspect on a murder in North Carolina. So when we got his DNA, we checked him out too, and he was in prison. It was I think he's serving still. It's a 45-year prison sentence based upon the crime he committed after he was not prosecuted for Avery. So, for every wrongful conviction, the real assailant is left free, and sometimes that results in new victims, and that's what happened in this case.
Yeah, talk about an aftermath. So Avery now is a cult hero of sorts. People really don't talk about his sort of notorious past himself. He has an attorney, and then there looks like $1 million or more dollars is going to come his way in terms of a settlement for this wrongful conviction. So things are looking pretty good. How does he conduct himself? And what happens a couple of years later? Yeah,
he does a lot of TV interviews. He's back at the salvage yard. He's got a beer in one hand during one interview. He's got a long beard, shaved his head. He talks about wanting to move into an ice shanty, and in fact, he does move into an ice shanty that first winter. The small confines of a shanty made it feel like home, like prison. People get out of prison and they're, it's a totally different thing. They don't know what to order at a restaurant. They don't know how to live. And Avery, because he was exonerated, wasn't on parole, didn't receive any services. So his life went quickly downhill. The public didn't know that. They did not know that. They had, he was still a folk hero, and there was a charity put up for him so he wouldn't have to live in an ice shanty, but he wanted to anyhow. But he started to commit some minor offenses, and then on October 31st, Halloween Day, October 31st of 2005, just over 2 years after Steven Avery was exonerated and released from prison. A freelance photographer by the name of Teresa Halbach from this part of Wisconsin went missing. Her mother reported to the police about 3 days after she had seen her last that she was gone. She was missing. She's never gone that long. Teresa lived in a different place but kept in close contact with her mother. I believe she was 23 years old. The last person or the last assignment Teresa had with her photography business was to take a photo of a vehicle, a Buick, I believe, that Steven Avery was putting up for sale at the salvage yard for Auto Trader magazine. And the police traced down that she indeed did go that day to the salvage yard and took, and that's the last anybody knew of her. They searched Avery's the salvage yard and did not, on the initial search, find her car. It was a RAV4 SUV. It wasn't there, or they missed it at the time they searched it. But a few days later, a volunteer search party that was organized by Teresa's family and her friends, and by the way, she's just a wonderful young lady, was a wonderful young lady, just an amazing person in so many ways. But this volunteer search party found her vehicle in the corner of this vast rural salvage yard, covered in branches, partially concealed. And then I was on call, actually. The police called me, and we all went to the salvage yard, and a massive search, more than 100 cops from different jurisdictions in this area conducted a search. News, media, helicopters were circling overhead, because you have to remember, Avery was already this well-known figure in Wisconsin, and then this story of this young lady missing was already out on the news a few days, and then the two came together on this day. I think it was October 5th or so, about 5 days after Teresa went missing. That would be November 5th or so, about 5 days after Teresa went missing, that her car was found, that we were out at this salvage yard. And I remember it being a beautiful sunny day to start with when we got out there. It was a Saturday. And the search, police thought, we all kind of thought we're going to find Teresa's remains. You think the worst because we knew what Avery was about. And the whole thing, there was a feeling that this wasn't going to be good. And the day turned into a cold front went through, and a driving wet, a driving rain, windy, colder temperatures. We had a crime lab unit, a mobile crime lab unit from the state crime lab in Madison set up as sort of the headquarters with all these police going out from there. Big lights, floodlights, and the canopy. I'll never forget that, flapping in the wind late at night. Still no body, no nothing. Until about midnight or so, one of the police dogs hit on a burn barrel and then a fire pit a little bit later, and soon charred bones of a young adult female were located, as well as pieces of a cell phone and a camera, and later determined to be Teresa's bones.
Now, if police and you being the prosecutor knew what Avery was all about, or his potential, you knew that he had, well, I don't know when you knew, but that he had been in decline since he had been out of prison. Did the police believe that he was their likely suspect and just didn't search the property adequately? And was part of their approach a little bit tentative because what they had, the police wrongdoing and the wrongful conviction? Was there a little bit of that involved?
Yeah, I think the police were very skittish. It was another police agency that did the first search that did not see the vehicle, Teresa's vehicle. She's from Calumet County, one county to the west of here. So they had the initial investigation, the missing person thing came up there. They wouldn't have been so skittish, but they also knew of Avery's past. The police said, of course, they kept an open mind. Nobody's a suspect at this point, blah, blah, blah. But I'm sure, I know that, they didn't suspect him specifically, but they knew he was capable of this. And after all, he was the person that had called Teresa to take the photo shot.
Right.
But as soon as they found her car, then it became likely that, possibly the murder happened here in Manitowoc County, where the Avery salvage yard is located. Then the Manitowoc County, our county police and sheriffs and state patrol and our office got involved. And yeah, there was right from the start a skittishness. I'll admit that. I and the other prosecutor, we both instructed the police, look, we need always a Calumet County officer with a Manitowoc County officer as we search this, because no matter what happens, the claim is going to be made that we did it again, that we set up Mr. Avery. And sure enough, that was exactly the claim after Avery was arrested and the claim at trial.
Now, with this, you mentioned that it was, or we talked about that it was likely that he was going to get this big settlement. Did that play into, not to be cynical about lawyers at all, but did that play into the kind of attorney that he could secure, along with the high-profile nature of the case and his wrongful conviction, sort of a good for business, and maybe he's going to get some money ultimately anyway? Did that play into the kind of real aggressive defense that he did have finally?
In the murder case?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. His lawsuit was for $36 million, and he wouldn't make that. But,
No.
He had sued the county and the DA and the sheriff, both personally and in their official capacities. And he stood to make a very, in probably double-digit millions. And as soon as the murder happened, that wrongful conviction lawsuit, the value of it, of course, went way down as soon as Avery was arrested.
Yeah.
And he ended up settling for $400,000. And
really?
all of that went to pay for his legal defense team. So you're right. In the American system of justice, if you have money, you get a better lawyer.
Sure.
And these two that represented him really are very excellent attorneys and excellent people. They believe strongly in, putting the state to its proof and making sure the justice system works right. But they sure did mount an aggressive defense. And Avery, before he was arrested, because he was holed up in his cabin up north, after Teresa's car and the body parts were found, police still didn't feel they had enough, so they didn't arrest him for about a week. And on one of those nights, he called in to the Nancy Grace show, of all things,
wow.
and proclaimed his innocence live, out of the blue. He just calls Nancy Grace. And she had a guest host on at the time, and he was talking about the police are setting him up again, and he doesn't know what they're doing on his salvage yard. They've got the whole thing cordoned off. They could be planting evidence, and unbelievable how interesting all that was to watch it happen.
That's wild.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask was, what evidence, because this is important, because we talk about the vial of blood a little bit later, what evidence was found in that vehicle? And then we'll talk about the aggressive defense in terms of trying to get that evidence suppressed.
You bet. First of all, in the vehicle itself, there were 2 or 3 spots of blood in the interior portion of the vehicle, the RAV4 of Teresa's. And there was evidence at trial that was Mr. Avery's blood. there was other evidence that he had cut himself during this time at some point, and that he moved her vehicle and then was concealing it, and the next day probably would have put it into this huge car crusher, it's called, and who knows if any of this evidence ever would have been found, and maybe Mr. Avery wouldn't be in prison now. But anyhow, so there's these spots of blood that no question were Avery's, although where it came from we'll get to later in terms of the blood vial defense. But the other physical evidence was Teresa Halbach's keys, the keys to the RAV4. After 5 or 6 searches of his bedroom by Calumet County officers, 2 Manitowoc County officers did a final search of the bedroom, and in kind of shaking or the dresser, some keys popped out, or a key popped out and landed on the floor, and they picked it up, and that key was Teresa Halbach's ignition key to the RAV4. So now you have Avery's blood in her car, and you have her car key in his bedroom. You can see where this is going. I mean, either the defense is that they planted it all. Yep. Yeah. And that it's enough. Yeah, that with him asking her in the first place to take this photo, and specifically asking for her, because in addition to the freelance photography business she worked for this Car Trader magazine, or this photography company that took pictures for Car Trader, and Steven had her there before, and specifically asked that Teresa come out to take the shot of the vehicle, the picture of the car.
What was his demeanor like when police asked him, where is Miss Halbach? Did they get any indication of his guilt from that altercation?
No, he said she was here. She took the photos and she left, and he hadn't seen her since. He later said that he saw a car kind of following her shortly after she left that he had never seen around there. But he didn't seem nervous the way I understand it, and denied it.
What were the body parts that you referred to that they said you found, and was that in the burn can itself? Were there bones? Tell us about that.
Yeah, they were crushed and charred pieces of bone that an anthropologist later testified were those of Teresa Halbach. They must have got the DNA from earlier. There were other ones spread around the premises in different areas, actually. And there were bits of her camera charred, and I think a cell phone, and of her Daisy Fuentes jeans as well. Little buckles or something like that, or rivets, I believe. There was other evidence, too, that was not admitted into trial, but that is really the evidence that convinced most people that Mr. Avery was guilty, of the murder. His 17-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, was repeatedly contacted by the police because the police thought he knew more about it than he was telling them. And he denied knowing anything about it many times, but the police would bring him in, and 3 hours of questioning, and another instance, more questioning, and eventually he told them, he confessed essentially that he, along with his uncle, Steven, both raped and killed Teresa Halbach. And in an incredibly vivid press conference that was, live all over the major TV stations here in Wisconsin and some beyond, the DA who prosecuted Avery for the murder, we had to farm the case out. We had a conflict of interest, so the Calumet County District Attorney ended up prosecuting this. Went through in vivid detail this confession and this lengthy statement that Avery's nephew, Brendan Dassey, gave, and he was 16 years old, by the way, about how he came home from school and heard this woman crying in his Uncle Steve's trailer, and how both of them, I really don't even want to go into detail. It's as bad of a rape and of a death, a knifing and a shooting and a torturing as you can think of. It's just.
What was the motive he gave? What was the motive he gave for this all to happen?
Well, it was pretty clearly his uncle wanted to rape this woman, and she was handcuffed to the bed and screaming, and it was pure. I don't think Avery cared if he went back to prison. In fact, he told a reporter from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, who interviewed him about a year after he was out, which would be about a year before the murder, that he's just having such a hard time, can't handle it. He goes for long drives. Sometimes he was sort of reminiscing about the days in prison, out in the prison yard, looking at the jets that go by, and said, sometimes just put me back in there. I just can't handle it. So I think Avery's proclivities, his sexual deviance, mixed with his not being able to handle being out after 18 years of being in when he shouldn't have been in, all came together. And obviously he lacks any kind of human conscience to be able to do what he did here, because you know how she ended up, how Teresa ended up in a burn barrel, charred bone fragments. So the nephew went into great detail about how they disposed of the body. It was almost Dahmer-esque, which, by the way, is another Wisconsin product.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's incredible. Well, as I say, it to me, though, it seems, again, not that these killers make sense at all, but there seems to be that he had this overall, despite the optimism that some people thought, that, geez, he's going to get this money and his life is going to be turned around, and you say he had this, it was not healthy for him, and he really probably was institutionalized, but there seems to be with this crime some kind of animosity towards, or some payback that was represented through this woman. Is there? What?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Dan. There is a feeling on his part of entitlement too. Ticket, going like 95 miles an hour or something, and he kind of came in and said, "Well, big deal. I was in prison for 18 years. Who cares about this?" And he also testified at a drunk driving trial that I did. His girlfriend, Sorry, Dan?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. I think I had some interference on this end. But anyhow, he, after he was out, I had charged his girlfriend, who he just met this one night at a gas station, and they were both kind of lonely folks, and he ended up dating her after that. But she was charged with drunk driving, 6th offense, and it went to trial, and Steven Avery actually testified at the trial and perjured himself, I believe. This is after he was this folk hero, but before the murder. And basically said, no, she wasn't driving, I was driving, and I put the car in the ditch accidentally, and et cetera, et cetera. They didn't believe him. It wasn't a credible story. But what I'm trying to say is, yeah, I think he did think that the system owes him. He understandably had no respect for the system. I think he had respect for, judges more or less, because they didn't do this to him. But prosecutors and police, who could blame him for having no respect? And the anger that built up in him during those 18 years in prison, he got divorced. He got so angry at his wife for not staying with him. And the entire time in prison, you you could only imagine how prison itself affects someone for 18 years, but knowing that you didn't do it and you're sitting there for all that time. So yeah, whether it's a reaction out, against the system, or I tend to think it's more not caring if he went back to prison, with that secondary to his main problem since birth, probably. Psychological difficulties, or not since birth, but since 5 or 6 years old, probably. There's another side to this that I've learned since writing this book, too, running into people who knew the Averys. His mother used to tie him to a leash as a form of punishment outside to a tree, naked, when he was 5 or 6. If you're going to act like an animal, I'm going to treat you like an animal. That's what was reported to me, anyhow, as to what she told him and what she did. And, you can't. It's hard to imagine much of a worse childhood in terms of, if this is true, a mother and who should be nurturing, instead doing things like that, tying a young child naked to a tree in the front yard, like a dog on a leash. Mm-hmm. So who knows what drives this, but there has to be something, doesn't there, no matter how your childhood was, that should go off in your mind, that what he did, what he was doing. I don't, want to go into the detail on the radio, frankly, about how bad this was in that bedroom, mm-hmm. and how they killed her and how they disposed of her body, but some has to go off in one's mind, I would think, even though they're messed up, to say this is just wrong. You have this woman pleading for her life, and you're treating her like a piece of meat or worse. It just is. It's as bad as it gets.
But, I think this thing, we look at the aftermath, we look at the devastation, and what is it caused from? Of course, principally, these heinous, psychopathic, without a conscience, without a soul, rapists, killers, violent people with no concern for anyone, despite what they say about, family, close-knit family. But it started with the deputy and the sheriff and the district attorney Vogel not doing their job, not doing what they were entrusted to do. A system that they believe in, that they work in, that we pay honor to, they didn't do what they were supposed to do, which led to Gregory Allen continuing his reign of terror. And we could have had 10 murders. We could have 10 more rapes. We could have had all kinds of things that he could have done because he wasn't stopped. And then we have an innocent man. Pardon me? Then we have an innocent man. Yeah. And then we have an innocent man railroaded, and that damage. And we talked about his wife leaving him, but this is a guy that did seem to have, some semblance of a family life. I mean, he had friends and relatives, and he had family, and he had 5 children, and his life was ruined with those children. So,
yes, and his wife actually thought he was getting things together, and there's evidence he was. That he was at least trying to get on the right track before he was arrested that last time. And you're absolutely right. If it weren't for what the sheriff and the DA did, the woman in Green Bay would not have been assaulted, brutally assaulted. Perhaps other victims that we don't know about. They don't get caught for everything. And Teresa Halbach. The way life works, I mean, only Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey, his nephew, are responsible for her death. But had the sheriff and the DA not did what they did, Teresa Halbach would be alive today. Avery could have ended up in prison for something else, or he could have had his life gotten straight, together if he wasn't wrongfully convicted. Who knows what would have happened, but one thing always leads to another, doesn't it? What I had for breakfast this morning affected what I had for lunch. And Avery would not have been in a position to murder Teresa Halbach. So, yeah, it's a amazing story about consequences and what happens. One thing leads to another, to another, to another, and it all kind of comes around, good and bad.
It's an amazing story of justice that is served, though, that in the injustice is recognized by a prosecutor, because the Innocent Project are not the only people that know. It seems incredible that prosecutors, even given the kind of evidence that you saw, DNA evidence of another perpetrator, we're either not going to release this guy, we're not going to release this guy easily, we're not going to exonerate this guy, we're not going to clear this guy completely, or we're just not going to pursue it. Or, so I was surprised that, and probably the weight of having somebody like you involved, that he was released quickly, which probably didn't do him any good either, but that still, that I think that this is a story of injustice, but justice served, but in the end, the damage had already been done, and regardless, Avery still is a guilty man. Teresa Halbach is an innocent victim along with her family, and Penny Bernson and her husband were also manipulated and used and traumatized by this entire system. So, again, it's an incredible story, and I congratulate you on a spellbinding book about a spellbinding case. And I want to thank you very much, Michael, for coming on talking about The Innocent Killer. Very engaging book. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, I sure appreciate you having me, Dan, and it's always good to talk to you.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Michael, and hope to talk to you again soon. And you have yourself a good night. Thank you.
You too. Thanks. Take care.
Good night.